I'd like to thank Worcester University, remembering Srebrenica, and in particular Dr. Chapman for inviting me here to give me an opportunity to try and give some focus on the work, the forensic work that has been done in Bosnia over the last 20 years. Adrian's talk there was brilliant because it's probably half my talk in two, because he's talked about the history of Yugoslavia, something that I was going to touch on, but was terrified that I got any of my facts wrong, because I'm unlike him, I'm not a historian. But nevertheless, I have been known to ramble on, so if someone can give me a 5-minute warning and I can rattle through the slides a bit quicker. So I'm just going to start, first of all, by, this is sort of a CinemaScope picture, but I just wanted you to see a picture of the former Yugoslavia before the war, and in particular the triangular shape and the lighter colour is that of Bosnia. You can see that it's surrounded in the west and the north by Croatia, and by Serbia on the east, and south by Montenegro, which is a predominantly Serb community. In Bosnia itself, there are Croatian, Bosnian, Serbian, and Muslim Bosnians, and the country was predominantly a Muslim country. However, and I won't go through the whole war story again, but when Bosnia decided to declare themselves an independent country in 1992, they did so because of fear of what the plan from Croatia and Serbia was, which was to carve up Bosnia, get rid of all the Muslims, and create a greater Croatia and greater Serbia. And the problem for the Bosnian population, for those that couldn't get out, was that it's virtually a landlocked country. And when the ethnic cleansing began, people were being moved from one place to another, and often they were cleansed on a number of occasions. And the next slide shows another map of thousands of maps that were created almost daily during the conflict. This is basically how it's turned out now, where the red areas, including Srebrenica, are predominantly Serbs, and the blue areas are where Muslims were cleansed and replaced by Croats in the blue area. And the two green areas, or 2 or 3 green areas, are now all that's left of the Muslim population. And so in, I think it was 1993, the UN, realising that it was a catastrophic event happening in Bosnia, decided that they would create safe areas. And I use the word area very distinctly, because that's been misunderstood over the years, because people call it a safe haven. The UN were very deliberate in the terminology. They didn't want to appear to be protecting the Bosnian Muslims, because then they would be accused by the Serbs of taking sides in the conflict. So they called them areas. Haven means an element of protection. Area doesn't really mean very much at all. And I'm not sure what the wisdom of creating these safe areas was, because immediately they were created, they were completely surrounded by Serbs, and sieges, as Aidan talked about, lasted for 3 years or more. But 2 of those safe areas in particular, Srebrenica and Tuzla, and to some extent Žepa, are quite close to the border of Serbia, and they became immediate targets for the Serbs. So, this is a pastel drawing by an artist called Peter Hausen, who was the official war artist for the Imperial War Museum, and he went out there in 1993, and this drawing to me is quite important, because it shows the barbaric level that the Serbs went to ensure that the Muslim population didn't stop. This goes back centuries to Vlad the Impaler, and Peter Howson saw this happening. Saw the bodies on the poles. I saw the poles that the victims had been taken down long since. And as I say, this was the horrific road signs that were there for the Bosnian Muslims. And this is a description that we came across quite often in Killing a House, where the Serbs would, after cleansing the people, would shoot the houses in some strange way in order to give this sense of, you can't come back here. They would turn on the gas, chuck a grenade in and blow the roof off the building. And also, if you can just see in this picture here, there's some yellow tape. That's to warn people that there are mines there to prevent anyone from trying to retake the house. And when I first went there, I'll tell you a bit more about my involvement in a minute, but we had to drive from Zagreb in Croatia all the way down to Tuzla. And as we entered into northern Bosnia, we began to see immediately the carnage that was created there. And similarly, the targets, as always in conflicts, are the religious buildings. And the mosques were no exception from that. They were systematically destroyed. And interestingly, as in part of our investigations, we discovered that the rubble from some of these mosques was used to cover up the bodies in a symbolic way, if you like, saying that we're not only burying you, but we're burying your religion as well. I won't go into any detail about the build-up to Srebrenica. Aidan has already spoke about that, but just a few dates to notice that in the build-up to the Ratko Mladic taking over Srebrenica, on the 8th of July, the Serbs overtook the Dutch observation posts surrounding Srebrenica, and they captured 30 Dutch soldiers and held them hostage, because what Serbs were afraid of was the UN, and in particular NATO, trying to prevent them from doing this by bombing them using the air power, the significant air power that they had. And there was a reluctance by the Dutch to order these airstrikes to prevent the Serbs, because A, they would be accused of taking sides, but also, and not unreasonably, their soldiers would be killed. And one Bosnian Muslim put it correctly when he said 30 Dutch soldiers equals 30,000 Muslims. And then on the 10th of July, however, the Serbs started shelling Srebrenica prior to entering there, and the commandant in charge, Colonel Karamans, requested NATO support. And then we're back to the politics again, where the UN were prevaricating. They didn't know whether to get these attacks because of the knock-on effect. It could intensify the war. And on the 11th of July, the day of the entry of the Serbs, Karamans is told that the air support request that he had sent was sent in the wrong forms, so they couldn't send the bombers over. However, two planes, one plane dropped 2 bombs in Serb positions, and they knocked out 2 tanks. That resulted in 400 more Dutch soldiers being taken prisoner and held hostage. And so, this is Potocari, where Val and I visited recently. And it was quite interesting for me to be there, because it gave me a sense of what actually happened. This is a battery factory right next door to the Dutch UN headquarters, and down the road is Srebrenica. And as the Serbs began to enter Srebrenica, the population en masse, 30,000 of them, moved out of Srebrenica to seek protection from the Dutch, who were crammed into this building and overspilled into the grass and so on. The men who were aware that what was going to happen to them in the main fled into the woods and tried to run to Tuzla. It's 40 miles away, but the Serbs were waiting for them, and they were captured and killed. And so here's Mladic making demands that the UN hand over all the men in Potocari. He did have a TV camera crew with him at all times there, because he wanted to come across as a kind man, and so he was filmed passing bread to the women and sweets to the children and so on, and reassuring them that they were going to Tuzla, which was the next safe area, provided he would provide buses for them, and they would all be safe. Now, we often talk about the men and the boys who were killed in Srebrenica, but we mustn't forget what happened to the women and children. You can read this caption where it was alleged that Mladic decided that his soldiers would be given the fruits of war. And so he apparently suggested that the men single out the good-looking Bosnian women and do with them as they will, and at the same time informing the men who had been captured, who thought that they were going to work camps, at least that's what they were told, that there would be blood up to your knees. And I'd just like to have a read of this. It's testimony given by a woman in the Hague War Crimes Tribunals, and it's just to give you a sense of an incident or incidents that happened there, and it's better if you read it rather than I try to describe it, I think. Okay. And so this is where I suppose the forensic teams became involved. This is an aerial photo of a mass grave in a place called Nova Kasaba, which is one of the first graves that I visited when I first went out there. There were many others, of course, and these are satellite photographs that were released to the media, and because of what was happening in Srebrenica, world opinion started to change about what happened to the Muslim population there, and there was a demand that something be done about it. And so ICTY, that's the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, ICTY for short, they commissioned forensic teams from all over the world, really, to volunteer to go out and help exhume the graves and carry out the forensic investigation to try and provide evidence against the perpetrators who had been indicted by ICTY to bring them to justice. And those teams were made up of forensic specialists, in the main pathologists who were experts in dealing with homicides in their own country, but they included, as well as pathologists, there were anthropologists, archaeologists, there were radiographers, forensic technicians, police and support staff. And so there were quite small teams, at least at the beginning, until we saw the size of the problem that we were going to have to deal with. And so each team would have to declare that they were non-partisan, non-judgmental, and the job was simply to collect, secure, and provide evidence of a legal death for ICTY. And the team members were encouraged to live with the local population in order to try and help support the economy, because the whole country, its infrastructure was devastated, and poverty and unemployment was just rife. And so I'm beginning to come to the process, and I hope it's not too boring for you, but what happens is that once a site's been established by aerial photography, as I say, a team would go in, an investigation team would go in and look for signs of an exhumation, of a mass grave. And they would see in the side of the road, for example, earth being gouged out, which was used to bury some of the victims. Then the deminers would go in and check for explosives or mines or anything dangerous for the exhumation team. And then, as in any homicide case, crime scene investigators would go in and photograph and gather up any evidence they could find, and it would be bullet casings or clothing or anything at all that they could find that could help add up to the eventual picture. And here you can see the beginning of the uncovering of a grave, and you can see those little red flags. That would be every time someone found a skull, they would put a little flag in to denote a human being. And this site was, I believe, the Palici Farm grave site. And when I went to see the Nova Saba site, it was exactly the same sort of scenario. But when I saw these little red flags, it kind of reminded me this year of the War Memorial in the Tower of London, where the ceramic poppies were flowing out, a very touching memorial. When I saw the first grave, it was at much less scale, but it was quite a poignant moment. And I hope this doesn't disturb anyone, but there's no getting away from how horrendous these places are. This was what was known as a secondary grave. A primary grave is where individuals are killed and put into the ground. The Serbs, when they realised that they could be in trouble and that the international community were out to arrest people from, I would say, around August of 1995 to the spring of 1996, the Serbs re-entered these graves, took all the bodies out, and using mechanical diggers, tore the bodies apart, and then took them into areas of Republika Srpska where they thought it would be impossible to find them. And what this must have done to the families when they found this out, it must have broken their hearts. Now, and if you take Muslims in particular, where in their religion they believe that a body must be buried whole, it must have been absolutely devastating for them to find this out. However, that didn't mean that the forensic teams didn't have work to do. It just meant that it was going to take a lot longer and it was going to be quite difficult. And I think it's worth pointing out at this stage that ICMP, that's International Commission on Missing Persons, which began their work out in the field trying to find the missing by speaking to their relatives and so on, they became much more active and involved in the identification of the body. Our job was to try and establish whether a war crime, a crime against humanity, or was genocide. That was a decision made by the judiciary. Our job was simply to establish whether or not people had been murdered. ICMP fought very, very hard to try and establish a laboratory in Sarajevo where they could look at DNA samples that we could provide them to try and help identify all of the victims. And to do that, they would get matches from the living relatives of their DNA and try and match them. And they were very successful, thanks mainly to the Americans and the British who funded the lab in Sarajevo, partly out of guilt, I would suggest, but nevertheless it was a great move because at that time DNA was extremely expensive and took forever to try and get results on. What ICMP have done in Sarajevo is nothing short of miraculous because of the so-called 8,000 plus or 7,000 plus victims. To date, they have positively identified 6,500 human beings. And that is a forensic joy, basically, that's never been done before. To be able to do that is quite remarkable. And those bodies can be handed back to the families after all this time to be buried respectfully. And so, thanks to them, perhaps perpetrators in the future might think twice about what they do. And I should say that some of these body parts were in not one or two, but up to 5 or 6 different graves. And by patients pulling them together, taking DNA samples, we can reach an overall picture. Excuse me. So, moving on. Back to the process. The thing about a mass grave, as I say, it's obviously it's a horrendous sight. It affects all of your senses. My first thought when I looked into a grave was it was just a pile of old rags, until you begin to see a bone, a foot, and then a head. You realise it's smell. And I had worked in mortuaries for 40, well, but then it was 30 years or so, dealt with murders of all kinds. But the smell of a mass grave is unforgettable. I can still smell it to this day, believe it or not. The bodies would then be taken to a temporary mortuary, and I'll be brief about these, but I think it's important to say that the conditions that forensic teams had to work under would be unacceptable in any other society, certainly in the West. This was the place that we were given on the first team, which I was part of, were given this place, which was a bombed-out factory. The parts of the roof had been blown off. It was directly facing the where the Serbs were in the hills. There was no electricity. We had to provide generators to get some light in, and there was no running water. And what the authorities, when they established these places at the early times, they just don't think about what people have to endure while they're working there, and I'll explain a bit more about that in a second. This is another mortuary, just to give you another example, that I worked in Prizren in Kosovo in 1999 when the Serbs were in retreat. We were given this place, which was a grain store formerly, and what no one thought about was that grain attracts rats, and so our first job in the morning was to chase dozens of rats out before we could actually start our work. And I should say that I have dealt with victims on all sides. I've dealt with Croats, Serbs, Bosnians, and Kosovans, and all of them, all sides, atrocities were committed against and by all of them, although nothing in the scale of Srebrenica. I've also worked in concentration camps of Marska and Luka, and the atrocities that were committed there were totally beyond my comprehension, but the numbers were nothing compared to Srebrenica. In this mortuary, because we took in Serb victims, because the elderly and the infirm couldn't retreat, and the Kosovan Liberation Army meted out awful revenge on the Serbs that were left behind. And because we took in their bodies just as a matter of respect, basically, they burnt down the mortuary and we had to move elsewhere. And finally, in mortuaries, this is a town called Visoko in central Bosnia, where an entrepreneurial businessman realised that a lot of money could be made by with the deaths, and so he built a purpose-built mortuary that was used from 1997 right up until 2001, where all of the bodies from all of the grave sites in Bosnia were driven to them, and it meant the places were more secure for the people working there, and it made a lot of money for the businessman. The bodies were delivered to the mortuaries in body bags, in refrigerated containers. Each container could hold up to about 200 body bags. Part of my job was to try and ensure respect for the dead at all times, and And I was in despair at times because, again, because of the numbers. It was hard to keep on top of that. You can see the state of the bodies as they were coming into us. Another issue for the team was security. There was an awful lot of people in Bosnia who didn't want our work to succeed. The NATO troops, and in our case it was Americans, didn't want to know us either, because they saw us as a bloody nuisance that was only stirring up more trouble when they were trying to keep the peace. And so we had to hire our own security people. And there was lots of media attention as well. And the last thing that you would want to see in the newspaper is dead bodies lying around, especially if you were a family member. And each day we received a briefing from the person in charge of the gravesite and the pathologist in charge, these two main characters here, who would explain to us what we were going to be doing that day, where the bodies came from, who would be working on what, and also what our workload, our expected workload for that day would be. And first thing that was done was that the police would photograph the contents of the body bag, no matter what was in it. The cameras belonged to ICTY, they were secure, they couldn't be used for anything else, because all these photographs could be used in evidence against the perpetrators. And examining the body, we could see quite early that many of the victims had their hands tied behind their back and were blindfolded. And I'll mention a point in that about Radovan Karadzic in a second or two. Radiography was especially important, not just so that we could identify where the bullets were in the body. It was my job to try and extract them, because they could be used in evidence as well. But also because we learned that when the bodies were taken out of the primary graves, by this time they were starting to decompose quite badly. And the Serbs, when they put them into other grave sites, it was reported that they were placing explosive devices in some of the bodies in an attempt to dissuade people from working on them. And there were occasions where we had to evacuate the mortuary because of suspicious looking wires and explosives. And to me this is quite a natural photograph, but I'm sure you'll agree it's quite gruesome. On the left you have a forensic technician removing a femur and scraping the flesh from the bone, because the bodies were in various stages of decomposition. She's doing that for the anthropologist who's standing in the middle, whilst the pathologist is working in another part of the body. The reason for showing this is that in the early days, the equipment that we were given was pretty Spartan. Here people are wearing their outdoor shoes. You can see body parts, body tissue that had been dripped onto the floor, because we didn't even have tables, we just used trestles with a tray on top of them. And so people were tramping around this tissue all day long, and then going home back to their accommodation, stinking of death, and the people who we lived with knew right away what we were doing. And it turned out where I stayed, it was two women that stayed in the accommodation. Every single male member of their family had disappeared. So you can imagine the thoughts that were going through their head when we came home to work. And it was quite dangerous in a sense as well, this work from a health point of view. Because the all-powerful fly is something that I think should never be forgotten. They are so powerful, you have no idea. What would happen would be that when we took the bodies out of the refrigerated container, the maggots would be dormant because they would be cold and fast asleep. As the temperatures start to rise, so would the maggots start to pupate whilst they're in the body. And they were an incessant nuisance. But worse than that, they could be dangerous to health. Here you see a photograph of a team sitting around having a cup of tea or smoking a cigarette or having a bite to eat. What you can't see or hear is the flies buzzing around them. And so it really was no surprise that we had outbreaks of dysentery among the teams. And given that in this mortuary there was no running water, it was an awful place to work. Back to the process again, this is a Canadian anthropologist putting together almost like a 3D jigsaw puzzle, where she's placing bone fragments to try and make up a skull. Because what she's trying to do is establish if there's any trauma to that skull, and that would be photographed and used in evidence, as well as being able to be repatriated with the body. And one thing that I forgot to mention, whilst I mentioned that we were scraping the tissue of the flesh of bodies in order to clean up the bones so that the anthropologists and the pathologists could examine them. All of that tissue that was taken from the bodies was kept with that body all the time because, as I said earlier, the Muslim faith, they want the whole body, and however, we would hope that they would get the body back in a clean and respectable state. Excuse me, I'm drying up again. Thank you. So part of my job was to lay out the bones anatomically in order to establish not only for the pathologist to look at and decide whether there had been trauma or injury to the victim, but also to find out what was missing, because then the body would be put aside and kept and stored. In this case, I think it was just lower limbs or lower bones that were missing, and that body would be kept until eventually the limb was found, and it might come from an entirely different grave. And I'm showing this as one of the paintings from downstairs, and what puzzled us at first was why many of the victims we found were blindfolded and had their hands tied behind their back. And a local explained to us that it was probably because the Serbs couldn't look them in the eye when they killed them. But it later transpired that in Nova Kasaba, which was a grave that I mentioned that I'd visited, it was a football field. And the men were bussed out in a bus load of maybe 60 men at a time, blindfolded and hands tied behind the back. And the reason for that was that they wanted it to be an orderly execution. Had the men seen the piles of bodies as they built up, they didn't want them to panic and to cause them any fuss, so they blindfolded them so that the men hadn't a clue where they were. Last year, Radovan Karadzic was, when he was on trial, he was defending himself in court. And when it was put to him that men had been blindfolded in this way, his defence was that they weren't blindfolds at all. They were wearing headbands and that they had just slipped down. He couldn't answer the question, though, as to how they come to tie their hands behind their back. And many men did wear headbands, I have to say. And it's important to say that Radovan Karadzic's defence has always been that all the people that were killed in Srebrenica were Bosnian Muslim soldiers, and that it was a war, and that in wars people die. It was part of our job to establish that they had been executed, because what the tribunal wanted to establish was what level of crime had they committed. Was it a war crime, which is bad enough? Was it a crime against humanity? Or was it genocide, which is probably about the worst crime that anyone could face? And here you see another skull, a couple of skulls, that had been patched together, one with a blindfold. The thing about blindfolds is that all the victims wore the same, had blindfolds. They're all of the same material, often with the same type of knot tied in them. So it wouldn't have need a lot of forensic brain to establish that this was something that was done systematically. And in the other skull, you can see the exit site of a bullet where someone was shot, possibly under the chin, and the bullet exited through the top of the skull. When the soldiers, Serbian soldiers, were getting tired at the end of a day's killing, they would often spray the people, the men that were left in the sheds or buildings that they were to spend the night, they would shoot them just indiscriminately, particularly in the legs and feet, so that they couldn't escape during the night. I would imagine that that would be a pretty painful experience. I'm showing this painting simply to describe the indignity of death to some extent. Plastic buckets full of bones and, gathered up from the graves, but I'm afraid that's the way it is. Just highlight that there's a painted in small photograph there that I'd like to tell you about. The very first job that I had was I was given a boot, and inside the boot was a human foot, badly decomposed. And as I extracted the foot, I found a tiny little piece of paper that I handed over to the crime scene investigator, who you can see delicately teasing the paper apart. And what he came up with was this photograph, which shows 2 children and possibly 2 women behind them. And the artefacts that were found in the graves were very important when it came to handing them over to the missing persons, people who could take them around the country, interviewing families and so on, to try and help identify who the person was. But what struck me about this particular incident was the level that this man must have gone to try and preserve something of his family, because the men were robbed completely. They were told to take their clothes off, their money was stolen if they had any, and they were left often with nothing. And this man must have known that and was going to preserve this photograph. This painting is more symbolises what one of the procedures that we carried out, which was dealing with the clothing, which could be quite emotive. Here you see a Bosnian slipper, a Dutch football top, a pair of pants that could be regarded as camouflage pants that weren't, they were just a pair of pants, a blindfold and a child's shoe, because there were very small children that either died or were killed as well. And this one, I won't tell you the whole story. There's a few catalogues left downstairs at the exhibition. If you want to pick one up, it will give you stories of all of the paintings there. The point of this one was that there's a bullet entry on just above his heart here, with an exit down his lower back. And this kind of described to the pathologist that the man was on his knees when he was killed. He could have been forced on his knees, or he may have been in prayer. Because clothing was vitally important. As I said earlier, you couldn't attribute any article of clothing to any of the victims. They might have been wearing somebody else's clothing, and to prove in court that it did belong to that person would have been that was wearing it would have been unacceptable. So it was secondary evidence, if you like. However, there was such a demand for the families to know what happened to their men, because they still clung on to the hope that they were still alive. They just couldn't believe that so many men had been murdered. And so they came along to the mortuaries on days that the team dreaded, quite frankly. As the women came, usually it was women that came into the yard where we laid out the clothing for identification. What we hoped for was no sound at all, but inevitably you'd hear a scream or a shriek as someone saw an article of clothing that they recognised. And bearing in mind that the siege of Srebrenica had gone on for 3 years, mothers and wives could remember in tiny detail patches that they'd put on clothing. Even the stitching was individual to them, so there was no doubt that they knew who the clothing belonged to. And inevitably, the women would demand their loved ones' bodies, and they simply couldn't give them to them because A, we were still working on them, and B, we were waiting to try and repatriate the whole of the body, and we had to get permission from the authorities before we could release a body. So these were awful, awful times. This gentleman on the right, I'm sorry I've forgotten his name, but I worked with him so often. He and his colleague volunteered to do the clothes washing. Every single time I arrived there, I was deployed to the Balkans 9 times, but 7 times or 6 or 7 times to Srebrenica. He was always there, volunteering to wash the clothes, and it turned out that he was one of the survivors of Srebrenica who had hid under bodies until it was safe for them to get out. And miraculously, like Hassan Hassanovic, you mentioned, Lydia, he survived. But why he came to wash the clothing became clear. He was looking for his brother. And I'm afraid that the old story about your wallet or your pocket watch saving your life as the bullets bounced off them doesn't work that way with Kalashnikov. And this is just to show you maybe a bit more about the conditions under which we worked. We all wore these paper white suits, which in the summer, which in Bosnia gets very, very hot. Sweat buckets. Your wellies are actually half filled with sweat by the end of the day. And you didn't get a new one every time. Money was short, so we often had to wear the same paper suits until they fell apart. And so we would stick labels on the wall with our names on them to make sure we didn't wear someone else's sweaty suits. Getting back to respect for the dead, which was a big issue, I found this quite offensive, the way bodies were laid out. People, like anthropologists, would go in, enter this body store area, open up bags because they wanted to look at a bone again, and so on. It was so important that we had absolute strict protocols about who had access. And I became the mortuary bully by protecting the bodies from those who were only thinking about the solution, not about the victims themselves. And I like to think that we handed the bodies over in a respectable manner. However, on a return trip to Bosnia, I forget which year it was, back to Visoko, I noticed as we were driving to the mortuary, these 2 white containers were containers that I had worked on some months' work with bodies. Sometime in the last trip I was there, I could recognise, well, you'd get to know these things very, very well. And it turned out that after handing them back to the Bosnian authorities, instead of dealing with them, they dumped them in a lay-by. The refrigeration equipment had been taken away, and there were nearly 200 bodies in those containers, which were like ovens. And so what happened was that we notified the women of Srebrenica, the mothers, who came around and held a candlelit vigil. And that attracted the media, and they were gone the next day. We then notified ICMP, who then took charge of them, and those bodies were safely stored for identification. We often, the team discovered shallow graves, and this would be in the hills, in the forests, where hundreds, if not more, people were killed, including some women. And this is just an exhumation of a shallow grave. And this photograph always gets to me because the Sun-Times newspaper came along to take some photographs at the time when parents of a young girl who had been killed, she had been identified, and the mother insisted that she's getting it again, that she see the body. And the pathologist said, we can't let you see this body, we can show you the clothing if you like, but she insisted. However, we eventually relented, and the woman, she saw this body, and you can see her patting, she's got her hand over her heart, and she was patting her heart, and it occurred to me that what she was looking at wasn't what we saw as a decomposing corpse. Sorry for that. This is another painting, just it's a kind of symbolic thing. They've got 2 snuffed out candles which signify sudden death. A bowl of plums, because Slivovic, it's made from plums, was often drank by the Serbs as they killed their victims. A newspaper story called An Unimaginable Horror, all on top of a Muslim prayer mat. Top of this book is a skull. But the point of the painting is this book, because from 1996 right up until fairly recently, every time teams go out to do this work, they learn so much. and we never try to reinvent the wheel. All the protocols were written down. And this book by Professor Margaret Cox from Bournemouth University compiled this fantastic book, which is almost like a Bible to anthropologists about how to deal with a mass grave and the identification process. And not forgetting the animals, it was a surreal sight to see packs of Afghan hounds and Labradors and who were like skeletons. And it was quite scary to see these dogs because they too were ethnically cleansed, basically. Their families had to let them go, and so they ran around the country. And sometimes we worried about what they'd been eating. And here, so far, are those indicted by the International Criminal Tribunal. You see that there are 94 Serbs. Now, that is nothing like the numbers of people who killed during the wars. But at least 3 of those 94 Serbs have been found guilty of genocide. But just to emphasise that, that some perpetrators have been found due to the work that the teams have carried out that wouldn't otherwise have been found. But it must be terrible for the families who live in villages and towns throughout Bosnia, knowing that people like, I don't know, for example, a police chief or whoever who's a Serb was responsible for the killing of their loved one. And so we end with this photograph, the photograph of a painting, another painting by Peter Howson. This painting was rejected by the Imperial War Museum on the basis that Peter Howson didn't actually witness it. But however, as I said earlier, he has witnessed some terrible horrors that he has documented. But this painting for me is almost magnificent because it portrays exactly the horrors that people had to endure. And if you look at the man on the right, his hands covering a family photograph, which I think also is quite significant. And you can see that men are wearing headbands as well, so maybe Karadic's just seen that painting. And so it leaves me with this question, which I'll end on. I've tried over many years now to try and come to grips with how such cruelty could be forced upon innocent people. And who was responsible for the genocide? Was it the soldier who pulled the trigger? Was it his generals? Was it the Serb politicians? Was it the Dutch soldiers who didn't protect those civilians? Or was it the West politicians who wrung their hands while knowing all the time that this was likely to happen? And what part did the Bosnian Muslim army and their politicians play? And finally, what about the international community who did nothing whilst this happened? And so, if nothing else, you've seen that some few perpetrators have been brought to justice, but I think for me, the important thing about this genocide is to never forget. Thank you.